I never thought I'd be the kind of person who gets their car stolen by their in-laws. Yet there I was, standing in our empty driveway, staring at the spot where my beloved Audi S5 should have been. The car I had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years to afford. The car that represented my climb from being a foster kid with nothing to becoming the senior creative director at one of the most prestigious advertising firms in Boston. My husband Greg was on the phone with his mother, his voice rising with each exchange. "What do you mean you borrowed her car? For Sarah's wedding? Without asking?" I could hear my mother-in-law's shrill voice through the phone, something about family priorities and how Melissa wouldn't mind since she's always so busy with work anyway. As if my property was community property, available for the taking whenever the Palmer family needed something. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 4 years, I'd been trying desperately to be accepted by the Palmers, a family that prided themselves on their New England heritage and connections, a family that had made it abundantly clear that I wasn't quite what they had envisioned for their son. Every holiday dinner, every summer getaway to their Cape Cod house, every family reunion had been an exercise in subtle degradation. The sideways glances when I mentioned growing up in foster care, the surprised, "Oh, how interesting," when I talked about my career achievements, as though success was unexpected for someone with my background. The way they'd redirect conversations whenever I spoke about my creative campaigns, but would spend hours discussing Sarah's wedding plans or her fiancé's family business. I had spent years convincing myself that it was all in my head, that I was being oversensitive. But taking my car without permission, that was a line crossed that couldn't be explained away. Greg hung up the phone, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "They took it to pick up some VIP guests flying in for Sarah's wedding tomorrow," he explained, running his hands through his hair. Apparently, Sarah's fiancé's family has some connections with celebrities and politicians, and they wanted to make a good impression. He couldn't look me in the eye. "They said they'll bring it back tonight after they pick everyone up from the airport." I felt a strange calm wash over me, the kind that comes when you finally accept a truth you've been avoiding. "You know what?" I said quietly. "This isn't about the car. This is about respect. And your family has never respected me." Greg started to protest, but his words sounded hollow, even to him. Deep down, he knew it was true. The Palmers had always treated me like an outsider, someone who should be grateful to be allowed in their precious family circle. What Greg didn't know, what no one in the Palmer family knew, was that my latest advertising campaign had caught the attention of some very influential people. People who appreciated creativity and innovation, people who didn't care about my lack of pedigree or the fact that I didn't summer in the Hamptons as a child. One of those people was Elena Rodriguez, the media mogul whose companies controlled half the entertainment industry on the East Coast. She had personally called me last week, inviting me to join the board of her foundation supporting foster children in the arts. And more importantly, she had asked me to be her guest at this year's Met Gala, one of the most exclusive social events in the country. The invitation had arrived yesterday, a thick cream envelope with my name in Boston gold. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Greg. I was still processing what this meant for my career, for my life. But as I stood there in our driveway, something clicked. The wedding that Sarah had been planning for a year, the wedding that had dominated every family conversation, the wedding that had apparently justified stealing my car, that wedding was happening at the Bellevue Hotel tomorrow. The same Bellevue Hotel where Elena Rodriguez was staying this weekend, in town for a media conference. The same Elena Rodriguez whose endorsement could make or break social reputations in Boston's elite circles. Circles the Palmers had been desperately trying to enter for years. A slow smile spread across my face as I realized that sometimes justice arrives in unexpected packages. Have you ever been in a situation where the people who should support you the most are the ones who undermine you at every turn? where you find yourself constantly trying to prove your worth to those who have already decided you don't measure up? That's where I found myself with my in-laws, trying to earn respect from people who had no intention of ever giving it. But what would happen if the tables suddenly turned? If the power dynamic that had been so carefully established was completely upended in a single moment? Because that's exactly what was about to happen. And I never could have predicted how a stolen car would lead to one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Every family has its unspoken hierarchies, its silent judgments, its predetermined notions of who belongs and who doesn't. For years, I had accepted my place at the bottom of the Palmer family pyramid, the outsider who married in, the charity case who should be grateful. I had swallowed their backhanded compliments, endured their dismissive attitudes, smiled through their thinly veiled insults, all while building a career I was proud of, creating award-winning campaigns, making a name for myself in an industry where your background shouldn't matter as much as your talent. But tomorrow, at Sarah's perfect wedding, everything was going to change. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed social order of the Palmer family was going to be shattered. From the outside, the Palmers were the picture of New England aristocracy. They lived in a meticulously maintained colonial home in Beacon Hill with its brick facade and black shutters, a property that had been in the family for 3 generations. Robert Palmer, Greg's father, was a partner at one of Boston's oldest law firms specializing in corporate litigation. Margaret Palmer, my mother-in-law, served on the boards of several charitable organizations and was known for hosting the most elegant fundraisers in their social circle. They attended the right churches, belonged to the right clubs, and sent their children to the right schools. Their Christmas cards always featured the family in coordinating outfits, smiling on the deck of their summer house in Cape Cod, the very image of American success and stability. But behind closed doors, the Palmer family operated on a currency of obligation, comparison, and conditional love. Robert Palmer ruled the family with an iron fist wrapped in a cashmere glove. He never raised his voice, that would be too common, but his disapproval could freeze the air in a room. He had mastered the art of the devastating question. Are you sure that's the best decision? Or is that really what you think is appropriate? Questions that seemed innocent, but were actually loaded with judgment. He measured his children's worth by their adherence to his vision for their lives. And while he couldn't control Greg's career choice, he made sure to remind him frequently of what he viewed as a squandered potential. With me, Robert was unfailingly polite but distant, as though he was still waiting to see if this marriage was going to stick before investing any real emotional energy. Our conversations were superficial, centered around the weather or Boston sports teams, never venturing into anything personal or meaningful. The few times I had tried to engage him about my work, he had listened with a polite smile that never reached his eyes, before finding a reason to excuse himself. Margaret Palmer was the enforcer of the family's social code. Where Robert was cold, Margaret was actively critical, especially of the women in the family. Nothing was ever quite good enough. The house could be cleaner, the meal could be better prepared, the children could be better behaved. She critiqued everything from my career choices, advertising, isn't that rather commercial? To my appearance, oh, you're wearing that, how brave of you. She had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. Your apartment is so cozy. It's nice that you don't need a lot of space to be happy. Or, that dress is perfect for someone with your figure. When Greg and I announced our engagement, her first response had been concern about whether we could afford a proper wedding. When I explained that my firm was doing well and we had saved for it, she looked genuinely surprised, as if the concept of me having financial stability was completely foreign. She had insisted on being involved in every aspect of our wedding planning, not out of excitement or love, but out of fear that we might embarrass the family with something unconventional. On our wedding day, her first comment upon seeing me in my dress was, "Well, it's not what I would have chosen, but I suppose it suits you." Sarah, Greg's sister and the bride of the moment, had always viewed me as competition rather than family. Beautiful, Harvard-educated, and socially polished, Sarah had been her parents' pride and joy. While she had initially welcomed me with practiced warmth, that facade quickly dropped when she realized I wasn't interested in competing for her parents' approval. Instead, she seemed offended by my lack of deference to the Palmer family hierarchy. She would forget to include me in family emails or group texts, then apologize profusely when called out. She would reference inside family jokes in my presence, then say, "Oh, that was before your time," with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When my advertising campaign won a national award last year, she had congratulated me and then immediately mentioned her recent promotion, steering the conversation away from my achievement. Her fiancé, James Whitaker, came from another prestigious Boston family with connections to state politics, and their wedding had been the central focus of the Palmer family for the past year. The guest list was a who's who of Boston society, and Sarah never missed an opportunity to drop names of important people who would be attending, people who, the implication was clear, would never be in my social circle. I remember the first time I realized exactly where I stood with the Palmers. It was Thanksgiving, about 6 months after Greg and I had started dating. I had been nervous about meeting his family and had spent weeks preparing. I brought an expensive bottle of wine, wore a conservative dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and had rehearsed topics of conversation that I thought would impress them. When we arrived, Margaret had taken the wine with a tight smile and placed it in the kitchen, serving a different bottle with dinner. Throughout the meal, Robert had questioned Greg about his career choices while barely acknowledging my presence. When I tried to join the conversation about a recent Supreme Court decision, I had majored in political science before shifting to advertising, Sarah had cut me off with, "It's a bit more complicated than it seems to outsiders," effectively dismissing any perspective I might have. Later, I overheard Margaret in the kitchen telling a relative on the phone, "She's not what we expected for Greg, but she seems nice enough. No family to speak of, but at least she has a job." I had stood in the hallway, clutching the dessert I'd brought, feeling like an intruder. That night, in our hotel room, I had cried, while Greg assured me they'd just needed time to get to know me. "They're traditional," he had said. "They'll come around." 4 years later, I was still waiting. Then there was the art show debacle. I had been selected to have my photography showcased at a small but respected gallery in Cambridge. Photography had been my escape during my years in foster care. Capturing beauty in unexpected places had given me hope when little else did. The showcase was a personal triumph, featuring a series on resilience in urban landscapes. I had invited the entire Palmer family, hoping they might finally see a different side of me. Greg had been incredibly supportive, helping me frame the pieces and standing proudly by my side at the opening. But an hour into the event, it was clear that his parents and Sarah weren't coming. Later, Margaret explained that they had a prior commitment they couldn't miss, which turned out to be a neighbor's dinner party. "We didn't realize your little hobby was so important to you," she had said when I couldn't hide my disappointment. "You should have said something." The message was clear. My achievements, my passions, the things that defined me, they simply weren't important enough to warrant a change in the Palmer social calendar. That night marked a turning point in how I approached my relationship with Greg's family. I stopped trying so hard. I stopped seeking their approval. I focused instead on my relationship with Greg and on building my career. The latest gesture I had made, the one that had backfired so spectacularly, was a genuine attempt to connect with Robert over something he valued. Knowing his love for classic cars, I had used my connections to get tickets to an exclusive vintage car show featuring several rare models from the 1950s and 60s. These weren't just any tickets. They included a private tour with one of the most respected classic car collectors in the country, someone Robert had mentioned admiring. I had presented the tickets to him at their 4th of July barbecue, hoping to finally find some common ground. Robert had seemed genuinely surprised and momentarily pleased, examining the tickets with interest. But then Margaret had interjected. "Oh, but that's the weekend of the Whitakers' pre-wedding party at their summer house. We couldn't possibly miss that." Robert had handed the tickets back to me with a polite but dismissive, "Very thoughtful, but unfortunately we have prior commitments. Perhaps Gregory would enjoy this sort of thing." The subtext was clear. No gesture I could make would ever be significant enough to take priority over the Palmers' social obligations, especially those related to Sarah's wedding. Greg had been furious, but I had just felt empty. It was the last time I would try to win their approval. What none of the Palmers knew, what I had discovered just last month, was that Elena Rodriguez and I shared more than just a professional connection. While reviewing some old foster care records for the Foundation project, I had stumbled upon a startling revelation. Elena had been in the same foster home I had lived in, albeit 15 years earlier. The family that had given me my first camera, that had shown me what a loving household could look like, had done the same for Elena decades before. When I mentioned this coincidence to Elena during our initial meeting, she had been visibly moved. "The Clarks," she had said, tears in her eyes, "they saved my life." We had spent hours sharing stories about David and Susan Clark, about the little yellow house in Dorchester, about the photo albums they kept of all their kids. This connection had cemented something between us beyond professional respect, a shared understanding of the journey we had both taken. Elena had confided that her foundation work was her way of honoring the Clarks' memory, of passing on the support that had allowed her to become who she was. And in that moment, I had felt something I never felt with the Palmers, a sense of belonging, of being truly seen and understood. The irony wasn't lost on me, that I would find this connection with someone the Palmers would give anything to impress, someone they considered far above their social station. But I wasn't yet sure how or if I would reveal this connection until they took my car, and I couldn't wait to see their faces when it happened. Sarah and James's wedding was being held at the Bellevue Hotel, Boston's most prestigious venue for society weddings. The 150-year-old hotel with its marble columns and crystal chandeliers had hosted generations of New England's elite as they said their vows. For the past year, it had been impossible to have a conversation with any member of the Palmer family without the wedding coming up. I had listened to endless discussions about the merits of different champagne brands, debates over the floral arrangements, and detailed analyses of the seating chart, which had apparently required diplomatic skills rivaling those used at the Geneva Convention. The night before the wedding, after discovering my car had been borrowed, I found myself standing in our bedroom staring at my outfit for the next day. A conservative navy blue dress that Margaret had subtly approved of. Navy is always appropriate, dear. I had originally bought it to blend in, to not draw attention, to be the non-controversial daughter-in-law for once. But now, looking at it, I felt a surge of rebellion. I put the dress back in the closet and instead pulled out a red designer dress I'd bought for a work event but never worn. Elegant, striking, and definitely not what Margaret would consider appropriate for a family wedding. As I laid it out, I also placed Elena's invitation on my nightstand, the heavy cream paper with gold embossing catching the light. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I would finally stop trying to make myself smaller to fit into the Palmer family mold. My car was returned late that night. Greg's father had dropped it off, leaving the keys in the mailbox without even ringing the doorbell. The tank was nearly empty, there was a coffee stain on the passenger seat, and someone had changed all my radio presets. It was such a perfect metaphor for how the Palmers treated me, using what was mine without permission, returning it damaged, and not even having the courtesy to acknowledge the imposition. Greg was livid, insisting on confronting his father at the wedding, but I asked that he not to. Tomorrow isn't about this, I told him, a plan already forming in my mind.
Let's just enjoy Sarah's big day. He had looked at me skeptically. Normally, I would have been equally angry, but relief had won out over suspicion. What he didn't know was that I had texted Elena, confirming our breakfast meeting at the Bellevue Hotel's restaurant at 9 a.m., 3 hours before the wedding ceremony was set to begin. "Perfect timing," she had replied. "I'd love to meet your husband too, if he's available." I had smiled at that. Greg would be there, but so would the entire Palmer family, gathered for the pre-wedding brunch in the hotel's garden terrace, the same garden terrace that overlooked the main restaurant. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect September day in Boston. Greg and I arrived at the Bellevue Hotel at 8:45 a.m. The Palmer family was already gathered in the garden terrace, where staff were setting up for the private brunch. Sarah, in a white silk robe with "bride" embroidered on the back, was directing the placement of flower arrangements while Margaret fussed over the table settings. Robert was deep in conversation with James's father, both men in matching navy blazers with the air of people discussing important matters. When they spotted us, Margaret hurried over, her face already set in a mask of contained disapproval. "Melissa, we expected you an hour ago. The bridesmaids are gathering for photos." I wasn't a bridesmaid, a point that had been made clear months ago when Sarah explained that she was keeping it small, just childhood friends, but apparently I was still expected to be at their beck and call. "Actually," I said with a calm I didn't entirely feel, "I have a breakfast meeting at 9, a work thing I couldn't reschedule. I'll be done well before the ceremony." Margaret's eyes narrowed. A work meeting on the day of Sarah's wedding? Surely you could have prioritized family just this once. The familiar guilt trip, the implication that my career was a hobby rather than a profession. Greg stepped in before I could respond. "Mom, Melissa rearranged her entire week for this wedding. One breakfast meeting isn't going to disrupt anything." Margaret pressed her lips together in a thin line, but was distracted by Sarah calling her over to mediate some crisis involving the table flowers. As we walked away, Greg squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry about that, and about the car, and about everything, really." I looked at my husband, this man who straddled two worlds, who loved me but had been conditioned his entire life to appease his family. Greg was a good man caught in a toxic family dynamic, and I knew how hard it was for him to stand up to his parents. Over the years, he had gradually become more assertive with them on my behalf, but it was a slow process, undoing decades of conditioning. "It's not your fault," I told him, meaning it. "But things are going to change after today. I need you to trust me on that." He looked puzzled, but nodded. "Whatever you need. I'm on your side. You know that, right?" I did know that, even when his actions sometimes suggested otherwise. The difference between Greg and his family was that Greg was capable of growth, of recognizing when he'd failed me and trying to do better. It wasn't always enough, but it was something I could work with, something worth fighting for. At precisely 9 a.m., Elena Rodriguez walked into the hotel restaurant. Even if I hadn't been looking for her, she would have been impossible to miss. Elena had the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it, an aura of quiet confidence that made people instinctively sit up straighter. At 55, she was stunning, dressed in a simple but obviously expensive black pantsuit, her silver-streaked dark hair cut in a sleek bob. Heads turned as she made her way through the restaurant, whispers following in her wake. I stood to greet her, feeling a rush of admiration and kinship. We embraced warmly, and I introduced her to Greg, who was clearly starstruck. "I've heard so much about you," Elena said to him with a genuine smile. "Your wife is one of the most talented creatives I've encountered in years." Greg beamed with pride, and I felt a wave of affection for him. This was the partnership I had signed up for. Mutual respect and shared joy in each other's accomplishments. As we sat down to order breakfast, I was acutely aware of the Palmer family on the terrace, visible through the large windows. Sarah had noticed Elena's arrival, it was hard not to, and was whispering urgently to her mother, who was trying not to stare but definitely staring. I pretended not to notice, focusing instead on my conversation with Elena about the Foundation's upcoming initiatives. From my seat, I had a perfect view of the Palmer family's reactions. Margaret was now openly watching our table, her breakfast untouched. Robert had joined her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and calculation, the look he got when assessing a potential business connection. Sarah kept glancing over while pretending to be engrossed in conversation with her bridesmaids. I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. How did Melissa know Elena Rodriguez? Why were they meeting? What did this mean? The power dynamic that had been set in stone for years, the Palmers as the socially superior ones, me as the outsider, grateful for inclusion, was visibly shifting before my eyes. Elena was saying something about the Met Gala, leaning in conspiratorially. It's going to be spectacular this year. The theme is American resilience. Rather fitting for both of us, don't you think? I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in years. Perfect, though I have no idea what I'm going to wear. Elena waved a hand dismissively. My stylist will help. She's a miracle worker. The casual mention of a stylist for the Met Gala, said without any attempt to impress, was such a contrast to the Palmers' calculated name-dropping that I had to suppress a smile. After breakfast, Elena insisted on meeting Greg's family. They're here for a wedding, right? I'd love to congratulate the bride. Before I could respond, she was already standing, smoothing her jacket with the air of someone accustomed to making entrances. Greg looked at me with wide eyes, and I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, while my heart raced. This hadn't been part of my plan. I had thought the mere sight of us together would be enough, but Elena was taking matters into her own hands. We walked out to the terrace, where the Palmer family collectively tensed at our approach. Sarah, to her credit, recovered quickly, summoning her most practiced social smile. Margaret looked like she might faint, while Robert stood abruptly, straightening his tie. "Everyone," I said, with a calmness I didn't feel, "this is Elena Rodriguez. Elena, this is Greg's family. His parents, Robert and Margaret, and his sister, Sarah, the bride." Elena stepped forward, extending her hand to Sarah first. "Congratulations on your wedding day. The Bellevue is a wonderful choice. I'm staying here for the media conference this weekend." Sarah shook her hand, visibly starstruck. "Ms. Rodriguez, it's an honor. We are such admirers of your work." Elena smiled warmly. "Please, call me Elena. Any family of Melissa's is a friend of mine." That phrase, "any family of Melissa's," hung in the air like a thunderclap. It completely inverted the established hierarchy, positioning me as the valuable connection rather than the Palmers. Margaret's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, confusion, calculation, and finally a desperate attempt at social recovery. "Ms. Rodriguez, Elena, how wonderful to meet you. How do you know our Melissa?" The forced warmth, the sudden possessive "our Melissa" was so transparent I almost felt embarrassed for her. Elena placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Melissa is joining the board of my foundation supporting foster children in the arts. Her perspective is invaluable. Not many of our board members have firsthand experience with both the foster system and tremendous professional success." There it was. My background, which the Palmers had always treated as something to politely ignore, being highlighted as an asset by someone they desperately wanted to impress. Robert was now looking at me with new eyes, reassessing, recalculating. Sarah seemed frozen in place, her perfect bride bubble suddenly punctured by the realization that her overlooked sister-in-law had connections she could only dream of. The power shift was palpable, uncomfortable, and absolutely exhilarating. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. I'll give them that. The Bellevue's grand ballroom had been transformed into an elegant, flower-filled garden, with white roses and hydrangeas cascading from every surface. Sarah looked stunning in her custom Verawang gown, and even I felt a twinge of emotion as she and James exchanged their vows. Throughout the ceremony, I was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere. Margaret, seated next to me, kept glancing in my direction with a new, calculating expression. Robert had insisted I sit in the front row with the immediate family, a place I had fully expected to be denied, given past family events. Even Sarah had hugged me, actually hugged me, before walking down the aisle, whispering a sincerely, "I'm so glad you're here," in my ear. It was as if my entire relationship with the Palmer family had been rewritten in the span of a breakfast meeting. Part of me was satisfied, but another part felt hollow. Was this really all it took? Not my talent, not my character, not my love for their son, but a connection to someone they deemed important?
The superficiality of it made my victory taste somewhat bitter. The reception was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, a magnificent space with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Public Garden. The Palmer and Whitaker families had spared no expense. A 10-piece orchestra played as guests entered. Elaborate ice sculptures adorned the seafood stations, and the champagne was vintage Dom Perignon. I stood with Greg near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Several of Sarah's friends, women who had previously barely acknowledged my existence at family gatherings, now made a point of complimenting my red dress and asking about my work. News of my connection to Elena Rodriguez had apparently spread through the wedding party like wildfire. Greg noticed it too, his expression a mixture of amusement and disbelief as yet another cousin who had never shown interest in us suddenly became our new best friend. "This is surreal," he whispered to me between greetings. "I feel like I'm in an episode of The Twilight Zone." I squeezed his hand. "Just wait," I murmured back. "It gets better." Dinner was served, and speeches began. James's father went first, giving a heartfelt, if somewhat stiff, address about family legacy and the joining of two great Boston families. Several of Sarah's friends spoke, sharing anecdotes from their Harvard days. Then it was Robert Palmer's turn. He stood, commanding the room with the same authoritative presence he brought to the courtroom, champagne flute in hand. "When Sarah was born," he began, "I knew she was destined for greatness." What followed was a 15-minute speech that was ostensibly about Sarah, but functioned as a highlight reel of the Palmer family's achievements, connections, and social standing. He praised James's family, he praised Sarah's accomplishments, he even praised his son Michael's medical career. Greg was mentioned briefly as a dedicated brother. I wasn't mentioned at all. It was as if, despite the morning's events, I remained invisible, an inconvenient addition that didn't fit into the carefully curated Palmer family narrative. Beside me, Greg tensed, his jaw tightening with each passing minute. When Robert finally sat down to enthusiastic applause, Greg leaned over to me. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his flush flushed with embarrassment. "That was inexcusable." Before I could respond, Margaret took the microphone, eager to add her own tribute to the family mythology. Margaret's speech was equally revealing. She spoke about Sarah as the daughter every mother dreams of, detailing her academic achievements, her charity work, her impeccable taste. She talked about how Sarah and James represented the perfect union of shared values and backgrounds. She reminisced about family traditions, vacations, and milestones, all stories that pointedly excluded me, even when they included events I had been present for. It was as if she was deliberately reinforcing the boundaries, reminding everyone that while I might have impressive connections, I would never truly be one of them. As she raised her glass for a toast, her eyes swept the room, briefly meeting mine with a look that could only be described as triumphant. "To Sarah and James, may you build a family as strong and united as ours has always been." The message wasn't subtle. Family meant people like them, not people like me. Despite the morning's power shift, despite their newfound interest in my career, some things hadn't changed at all. The Palmers might want to use my connection to Elena, but they had no intention of truly accepting me. It was at that moment that the hotel manager approached our table, leaning down to whisper in my ear. "Ms. Bennett, there's a delivery for you at the front desk." Curious, I excused myself and made my way through the crowded ballroom. At the desk, the concierge handed me a large envelope. This was just delivered by courier, marked urgent. I opened it right there, not wanting to miss more of the reception. Inside was an invitation. Not just any invitation, but the official invitation to the Met Gala, addressed to Melissa Bennett and guest. It was accompanied by a handwritten note from Elena. "Looking forward to seeing you there. The car will pick you up at 6 p.m. on the 5th. E.R." Also included was a smaller envelope marked wedding gift, containing a confirmation that Elena's foundation had made a substantial donation to a foster care arts program in Boston in Sarah and James's names. It was a perfect, elegant powered move. Generous, yet pointed. I returned to the reception just as the dance floor was opening up. Sarah and James had completed their first dance, and other couples were joining them. Greg met me halfway across the room, concern on his face. "Everything okay?" I handed him the invitation, watching as his eyes widened. "The Met Gala? Melissa, that's... wow!" He looked genuinely happy for me, proud even. It was one of the things I loved most about him, his ability to celebrate my successes without insecurity or reservation. "There's more," I said, showing him the donation confirmation. "It's the perfect wedding gift, don't you think? Generous, meaningful, and completely impossible to return." Greg laughed, a real laugh that lit up his face. "You're kind of brilliant, you know that." He kissed me then, in the middle of his sister's wedding reception, not caring who saw. It was a small act of rebellion against the family that had tried so hard to make me feel like I didn't belong. "Let's dance," he said, pulling me toward the floor. "This is actually starting to be fun." As we danced, I noticed Robert in deep conversation with one of James's uncles, gesturing repeatedly in my direction. Margaret was showing something on her phone to a group of her friends, all of them glancing up at me with new interest. The calculus was changing before my eyes. I was transforming from the foster kid they had to tolerate to a potentially valuable connection. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt a profound sadness. All I had ever wanted was to be accepted for who I was, to have my achievements recognized, my background respected rather than pitied or ignored, my love for their son deemed worthy. Instead, I was now being measured for my usefulness, my social capital. It wasn't acceptance, it was opportunism. As the song ended, I made a decision. I wasn't going to play this game anymore. I wasn't going to pretend that their sudden interest in me was anything but self-serving. If they couldn't value me for who I was, I didn't need their validation at all. The moment came during the dinner. The waitstaff had just served the main course, a choice of filet mignon or sea bass, and the room was filled with the gentle clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation. I was picking up my food, lost in thought, when Sarah clinked her glass for attention. "Everyone," she announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "I just want to thank you all for being here on our special day." She went on to acknowledge various friends and family members who had contributed to the wedding. And then, to my absolute shock, she turned to me. "And I want to especially thank my sister-in-law, Melissa, who has been so supportive throughout this whole process. Melissa, we're so lucky to have you in our family." It was the first time Sarah had ever publicly acknowledged me as part of the family, and it came with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The room applauded politely, and I felt dozens of evaluating gazes on me. I knew exactly what this was. Damage control, an attempt to publicly align themselves with me now that I had proven to have valuable connections. It was calculated, insincere, and the final straw. I stood slowly, glass in hand, the room quieting as I did. This hadn't been my plan. I had intended to let the invitation and donation speak for themselves, but something in me snapped at Sarah's transparent attempt to rewrite our history. "Thank you, Sarah," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I'm touched by your words, truly. Especially since this is the first time in 4 years that anyone in the Palmer family has publicly acknowledged me as part of the family." A hushed murmur swept through the room. Greg reached for my hand under the table, not to stop me, but in solidarity. I continued. "For those who don't know me, I'm Melissa Bennett. I grew up in the foster care system here in Boston. I put myself through college working 3 jobs. I built a career I'm proud of through talent and hard work. And for 4 years, I've tried to be part of this family, despite being consistently made to feel that my background, my career, and my very existence were somehow insufficient." The room was dead silent now, all pretense of eating abandoned. Margaret's face had drained of color. Robert was staring at me with a mixture of shock and fury. I've watched as my achievements were dismissed, my background shaded as an embarrassment, and my marriage to Greg was viewed as something he needed to overcome rather than celebrate. I've endured countless family events where I was treated as an afterthought. I've smiled through insults disguised as concern. I've had my property taken without permission because my needs were deemed less important than the family's social aspirations. I paused, looking directly at Sarah now.
And I've watched as the same people who couldn't be bothered to attend my photography exhibition suddenly find me fascinating now that they know I have connections they want to access. The silence in the room was oppressive. James was whispering urgently to Sarah, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. Margaret looked like she might faint. Greg's hand tightened around mine, a silent message of support. So, thank you, Sarah, for finally welcoming me to the family. It only took a breakfast with Elena Rodriguez to make it happen. I raised my glass in a mock toast. To conditional acceptance and social climbing, may we all get exactly what we deserve. With that, I placed my napkin on the table and walked out of the ballroom, head held high, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. I didn't look back, didn't wait to see the aftermath. In the lobby, I paused, my hand shaking with adrenaline. I had just publicly called out one of Boston's most connected families at their daughter's wedding. It was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I had ever done. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, half expecting to see an angry Robert or a tearful Margaret. Instead, it was Greg, his face flushed but his eyes clear. That, he said, was long overdue. He pulled me into a fierce hug, and I felt the tension drain from my body. I'm sorry it had to happen like this, I whispered against his shoulder. Greg shook his head. Don't be. They needed to hear it. I needed to hear it. I should have stood up for you more, should have seen what was happening. He pulled back, looking me in the eyes. No more. From now on, we're a team. If they want a relationship with me, they accept you, all of you, not just the parts that are useful to them. In that moment, standing in the opulent lobby of the Bellevue Hotel, I felt truly married for the first time, not to the Palmer family, but to Greg, the man who, when push came to shove, chose me. The hours following my exit from Sarah's wedding reception were a blur of buzzing phones and emotional conversations. Greg and I retreated to our hotel room upstairs. We had booked it anticipating a night of celebration, not confrontation. As soon as the door closed behind us, my phone exploded with notifications. There were texts from Sarah's friends expressing shock, messages from distant Palmer relatives I'd barely met suddenly claiming they had, quote, always thought I was treated unfairly, and even a few congratulatory notes from Greg's cousins, who apparently had harbored their own resentments against Robert and Margaret's social hierarchy. The most surprising message came from Michael, Greg's younger brother, who was supposed to be focusing on his medical exams. Been waiting for someone to say that to them for years. Sorry it had to be you, but also not sorry? Call me tomorrow. Greg's phone was similarly bombarded, mostly with outraged messages from his parents demanding he control his wife and fix this embarrassment immediately. He silenced his phone after reading a few aloud to me, each one more indignant than the last. They still don't get it, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. They're worried about the scene, about what people will think, not about why you felt pushed to that point. The first real conversation came the following morning when Greg's mother called my phone directly, an unprecedented event in itself. I answered with trepidation, putting it on speaker so Greg could hear. Melissa, Margaret's voice was tightly controlled, the kind of calm that masked fury. I hope you're satisfied with the disruption you've caused. Sarah is devastated. The Whitakers are shocked. Robert is... She paused, apparently unable to adequately describe her husband's state. I've always tried to welcome you into our family, despite your
unusual background. I've overlooked your career choices, your lack of social graces, even your inappropriate attire at family functions. And this is how you repay our generosity? By humiliating us at Sarah's wedding? The audacity was breathtaking. Her version of reality so divorced from what I had experienced that it felt like she was describing a different family entirely. Before I could respond, Greg took the phone. "Mom." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "What Melissa said was true. All of it. You and Dad have never truly accepted her. You've treated her as an outsider for 4 years. Yesterday was just the breaking point." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "We gave her a chance, Gregory," Margaret's voice finally said, her voice brittle. "She chose not to fit in." Greg's laugh was hollow. "No, Mom. You gave her impossible standards to meet, and the minute you thought she might be useful to your social climbing, suddenly she was worthy of acknowledgement. That's not family."
That's opportunism. The next call was from Sarah herself later that afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but Greg encouraged me to hear her out. "It's my wedding video," she said without preamble, her voice thick with emotion. "Everyone will see what you said. It's going to be in my wedding video forever." There was the Sarah I knew, concerned first and foremost with appearances, with how things would look to others. "I'm not going to apologize for telling the truth," I said quietly. "But I am sorry it happened on your wedding day. That wasn't my intention." There was a long pause. "Elena Rodriguez?" Sarah finally said, her voice small. "How do you even know her? Was that real, or did you somehow arrange it to embarrass us?" The question was so perfectly Sarah, unable to conceive that I might have genuine achievements or connections independent of the Palmer family narrative. "It was real, Sarah. I've been working with her foundation for months. My background, the one your family has been so ashamed of, is actually an asset in that world." Another pause. "We weren't ashamed," she protested weakly. "We just didn't think it was relevant." I let that sit between us. When you make someone feel they need to hide parts of themselves to be accepted, that's shame, Sarah, whether you intended it or not. The call ended shortly after with no real resolution, but perhaps a tiny crack in Sarah's perfectly constructed worldview. It wasn't much, but it was something. The most surprising development came 3 days after the wedding, when I received an email from Robert Palmer's private account. Not his office email, but his personal one. "Dear Melissa," it began stiffly, "recent events have prompted me to reflect on family dynamics that I may have overlooked. While I cannot condone the public nature of your statements at Sarah's wedding, I acknowledge there may be some validity to your perspective." It was as close to an admission of wrongdoing as I was likely to get from Robert Palmer, a man who had built his career on never admitting fault. The email continued with a formal invitation for Greg and me to join him for lunch the following week to discuss how we might move forward as a family. I showed the email to Greg, who read it with raised eyebrows. "This is unexpected," he said cautiously. "Dad never admits he's wrong. Ever." I wasn't sure whether to be hopeful or suspicious. Was this a genuine olive branch or just another calculated move? After all, having Elena Rodriguez's new board member as an estranged daughter-in-law wouldn't look good for the Palmers' social aspirations. Greg seemed to read my thoughts. "We should go," he said, "but with clear boundaries. No more trying to fit yourself into their mold. If they want a relationship with us, it has to be on terms that respect who you are, all of who you are." The lunch with Robert was surreal. He had chosen a quiet, upscale restaurant in Back Bay, neutral territory, away from both his office and the Palmer home. He was already seated when we arrived, looking
uncharacteristically unsettled. The Robert Palmer I know never fidgeted, never showed uncertainty. Yet here he was, adjusting his tie and rearranging his silverware as we approached. "Thank you for coming," he said formally, standing to greet us. The conversation started awkwardly, with Robert making stilted inquiries about my work that felt rehearsed. But as the meal progressed, something unexpected happened. When I mentioned a particularly challenging campaign I was working on, Robert actually asked thoughtful follow-up questions. When the topic turned to my photography, something he had previously dismissed as a hobby, he admitted he looked up my exhibition online and found the images quite compelling, actually. It wasn't warmth, exactly, but it was attention. Genuine attention for perhaps the first time. The most revealing moment came when I mentioned my foster parents, the Clarks, and their influence on my career path. Robert's expression changed subtly. "He had a teacher once," he said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from him. "Mr. Abernathy, in high school. My father wanted me to focus exclusively on debate team, but Mr. Abernathy encouraged my interest in jazz piano, said it would make me more well-rounded." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I never told my father, kept taking lessons secretly for years. It was a small thing, a tiny personal revelation that most people would share without thinking, but from Robert Palmer, it was monumental. A crack in the perfect facade, a glimpse of the person behind the patriarch." "Did you ever tell him?" Greg asked, clearly as surprised by this disclosure as I was. Robert shook his head. "No. By the time I felt I could, he was ill. It seemed unimportant by then." There was regret in his voice, and something else. A recognition, perhaps, of patterns repeating. As the lunch concluded, Robert addressed the wedding incident directly. "What you said was uncomfortable to hear," he admitted. "Margaret and I have certain expectations, certain standards we've always upheld. But perhaps we've been rigid to a fault." He cleared his throat. "I cannot promise immediate change. Old habits, as they say. But I would like to try to understand your perspective better." It wasn't an apology, not really, but from Robert Palmer, it was significant, an acknowledgement that there was something to apologize for. As we parted, he shook my hand formally, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Your connection with Elena Rodriguez is impressive, but your resilience, that's worth respecting on its own merit." It was awkward, imperfect, and possibly still colored by social calculation, but it was a start. My relationship with Margaret proved more challenging. Unlike Robert, who approached the situation with business-like pragmatism, Margaret seemed personally wounded by my public statements, or, more accurately, by the fact that others had witnessed what she considered private family matters. "A lady handles disagreements discreetly," she told me stiffly during a tense coffee meeting 2 weeks after the wedding. "Public scenes are for people without breeding." The irony of her using classist language while supposedly trying to mend fences was not lost on me. Still, I could see she was making an effort, in her own way. She had invited me to coffee, not summoned me. She had chosen a casual cafe near my office, not one of her usual society haunts. Small concessions, but meaningful from someone as rigid as Margaret Palmer. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came when she reluctantly asked me about my experience in foster care. "I simply cannot imagine growing up without certainties," she said, stirring her latte with precision. It was the closest she could come to acknowledging privilege, but I recognized the effort. It teaches you to adapt, I replied, honestly, to find value in yourself rather than in circumstances. Margaret considered this, her head tilted slightly. Sarah has always derived her worth from external validation, she said unexpectedly. It's made her fragile in ways I didn't anticipate. It was the first time I'd heard Margaret criticize Sarah, even mildly, and the first hint that perhaps her perfect maternal relationship with her daughter wasn't quite as perfect as advertised. The dynamic with Sarah shifted in unexpected ways. 2 months after the wedding incident, as the social media posts about her perfect day were fading from everyone's feeds, she reached out and asked if we could meet for drinks. Just the two of us. I agreed with some trepidation, unsure what to expect. We met at a rooftop bar downtown, neutral territory for both of us. Sarah arrived looking less polished than usual. Her hair in a simple ponytail, minimal makeup, dressed in jeans rather than her usual designer outfits. James and I had our first real fight last week, she announced without preamble, signaling for the waiter. About his mother, actually. She's been micromanaging our apartment decoration, and he won't stand up to her. She looked at me with new eyes. I kept thinking about what you said to my parents, about how you refuse to be diminished anymore. 2 martinis in, Sarah admitted something I never expected to hear. I've always been jealous of you, she said, examining her olive with intense focus. You built your career yourself. You don't care what people think. Even your relationship with Greg is real. He looks at you like, she trailed off. James looks at me like I'm a perfect acquisition, the right wife from the right family with the right credentials. By the end of the evening, we weren't friends, exactly, but we had reached a new understanding. Sarah was a product of her upbringing, just as I was a product of mine. The difference was that she was only now beginning to question the values that had been instilled in her, while my circumstances had forced me to define my own values early on. The gesto grandioso, my car that had been borrowed without permission, became a symbol of the shift in our family dynamic. A month after the wedding incident, Greg and I decided to sell it. Not out of spite or lingering anger, but because it represented an old chapter of my life. One where I sought validation through material success, where I hoped the right car or the right clothes or the right achievements might finally make me good enough for the Palmers.
We used the money to establish a small scholarship fund for photography students from the foster care system, partnering with Elena's foundation to maximize its impact. When we announced this decision at a Palmer family dinner, we had cautiously resumed monthly family meals, now hosted at our apartment rather than the Palmer home. The reactions were telling. Robert nodded approvingly, immediately asking about the tax advantages and offering to have his firm handle the legal structure pro bono. Margaret seemed puzzled, but made an effort to say it was very thoughtful. Sarah, surprisingly, asked if she and James could contribute as well. My wedding guests gave us 3 identical silver tea services, she explained with an eye roll that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I can't think of a better use for the return money. The scholarship fund became an unexpected bridge between my past and present. Through it, I reconnected with the foster care community that had shaped me, introducing Greg to a world he had only known through my stories. He embraced it with characteristic openness, volunteering his engineering skills to help renovate a group home, teaching weekend science workshops for foster teens. Watching him find purpose in this work, seeing him build relationships with kids who reminded me so much of my younger self, I fell in love with him all over again. The Palmers, to their credit,
made halting efforts to engage as well. Robert used his connections to secure internships for promising students. Margaret, after initial reluctance, began hosting an annual garden party fundraiser that became surprisingly successful. Her social network, redirected toward a meaningful cause, proved quite valuable. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, still instances where old patterns emerged, but there was progress, genuine progress that went beyond social calculations or appearances. The most unexpected twist came 6 months after the wedding confrontation. Elena and I had been working closely on the foundation, developing programs that combined arts education with practical career skills for foster youth. One evening, after a particularly productive board meeting, she invited me to dinner at her penthouse apartment overlooking the Boston Harbor. Over wine and a magnificent view of the city lights, she shared something that left me speechless. "I've been doing some research on the Clark family," she said, referring to the foster parents who had cared for both of us years apart. "Did you know David Clark kept journals? His nephew found them while clearing out the house after Susan passed last year." She pushed a leather-bound notebook across the table. "He wrote about all of us, all the kids who passed through their home. I thought you might want to read what he wrote about you." With trembling hands, I opened the journal to the marked page. There, in faded ink, was my 16-year-old self described with such love and insight that tears blurred my vision. "Melissa came to us angry at the world," David had written, "but beneath that armor is a soul of extraordinary sensitivity and perception. Her photographs reveal what she cannot yet say in words, that she sees beauty where others see only brokenness." Elena watched me read, her own eyes glistening. "He saw us," she said simply. "When no one else did, David and Susan Clark really saw us." In that moment, I understood that my true family legacy wasn't from the Palmers or even from my biological parents. It was from the people who had chosen to love me, to see me when they had no obligation to do so. 1 year after Sarah's wedding, that day that had become a pivotal moment in my life, I found myself standing in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, surrounded by celebrities, fashion icons, and cultural luminaries. The Met Gala had lived up to its reputation as the most exclusive social event of the year, and as Elena's guest, I had been welcomed into a world that would have seemed impossible to the foster kid from Boston. My dress, a stunning creation by an up-and-coming designer who had also grown up in the system, told my story through subtle architectural elements and textural details that represented both struggle and triumph. As I moved through the crowd, occasionally stopping for photographs or brief conversations with people I had previously only seen on magazine covers, I felt neither intimidated nor starstruck. Instead, I felt a profound sense of belonging, not because I had finally arrived in some social sense, but because I had arrived at a place of genuine self-acceptance. The journey that had begun with a stolen car and exploded at a wedding reception had led me here, to this moment of standing completely in my truth, surrounded by people who valued creativity, authenticity, and resilience over pedigree or social connections. Greg couldn't attend the gala with me. He was in Chicago leading an engineering workshop for foster teens interested in STEM careers. But he had FaceTimed me before the event, beaming with pride. "You look incredible," he had said, his face filling my phone screen. "Send me photos of everything." Our relationship had deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated after the confrontation with his family. With the pressure to conform to the Palmer family expectations lifted, Greg had blossomed, rediscovering passions and interests he had suppressed in his effort to be the son his parents wanted. He had left his corporate engineering job for a position with a nonprofit developing sustainable housing solutions, taking a significant pay cut, but finding far more satisfaction. Our apartment was now filled with his half-built prototypes and my photography equipment, a creative chaos that reflected our authentic selves. More importantly, we had established
clear, healthy boundaries with his family. We saw them monthly for dinner, on our terms. We celebrated holidays together, but felt free to decline invitations that didn't work for us. And most significantly, we never again pretended to be anything other than exactly who we were. The Palmer family had evolved in their own ways, some more dramatic than others. Robert had surprised everyone by taking a step back from his law practice, delegating more responsibility to younger partners while he focused on pro bono work for foster care organizations. Whether this was motivated by genuine altruism or by the social cachet of philanthropy remained ambiguous, but the impact of his legal expertise was undeniably positive. Margaret had struggled more with change, still clinging to many of her social rules and expectations. But she had made genuine efforts to understand my world. She had attended my latest photography exhibition, asking thoughtful questions about my process and inspirations. She still occasionally made tone-deaf comments about my background, but now she caught herself, sometimes even apologizing without prompting. Small steps, but meaningful ones. Sarah and James had postponed their plans for a perfect society baby, instead taking a year to travel and volunteer abroad, a decision that had initially horrified Margaret, but eventually earned her reluctant respect. Sarah had called me from Thailand sounding more relaxed and authentic than I had ever heard her, describing her work with local artisans and how it had changed her perspective on what constituted status and success. My professional life had transformed alongside these personal changes. The visibility from joining Elena's foundation board had led to speaking engagements, mentorship opportunities, and eventually, the launch of my own creative agency focused on authentic storytelling for mission-driven organizations. I built a team of talented individuals from diverse backgrounds, many of whom had overcome significant obstacles to pursue their creative passions. Our first major client had been, ironically, a luxury brand seeking to reinvent its image for a younger, more socially conscious market. A campaign that won industry awards and established our reputation for combining aesthetic excellence with authentic messaging. But the work that brought me the most joy was our pro bono project documenting the stories of foster youth across America, creating a traveling exhibition that challenged stereotypes and humanized statistics. The night the exhibition opened in New York, with several of the featured young people in attendance, I felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that no amount of social acceptance could have provided. The scholarship fund we had established with the money from my car had grown beyond our expectations. What began as a small initiative supporting 2 photography students had expanded to include mentorships, equipment grants, and exhibition opportunities for young artists from the foster care system. The annual fundraiser at the Palmer home had become a genuine highlight of Boston's social calendar, with Margaret throwing herself into the planning with unexpected enthusiasm. Last year's event had raised enough to fund 10 full scholarships, with Robert's law firm matching donations dollar for dollar. During her welcome speech at the most recent fundraiser, Margaret had said something that left me momentarily speechless. Our family has learned that true privilege isn't about where you come from, but about what you do with the opportunities you're given. She had looked directly at me as she said it. A subtle acknowledgement of how far we had both come from those early days of thinly veiled disapproval and desperate attempts to fit in. The David Clark Photography Mentorship, named after my foster father, had become the centerpiece of our foundation work. Using his journals as inspiration, we had created a program that paired established photographers with foster youth, not just teaching technical skills, but also nurturing the unique perspective that comes from living between worlds. The program culminated each year in a group exhibition where the students displayed work alongside their mentors, creating powerful visual dialogues about resilience, identity, and belonging. At the most recent exhibition, I had watched a shy 16-year-old girl
so reminiscent of my younger self that it was almost painful, beam with pride as visitors engaged deeply with her photographs. Her foster mother had approached me afterward, tears in her eyes. Before this program, she barely spoke, she had told me. Now she has a voice. In that moment, I understood that this was my true legacy. Not social connections or professional accolades, but creating spaces where young people could be truly seen, just as the Clarks had once seen me. My relationship with Elena had evolved from professional collaboration to genuine friendship. She had become a mentor and confidant, someone who understood both where I had come from and where I was going in a way few others could. Success is meaningless if you have to become someone else to achieve it, she had told me once, as we worked late into the night on foundation proposals. The real victory is succeeding as yourself. It was a philosophy I had embraced fully, no longer measuring my worth against the Palmer family yardstick or anyone else's. Elena had also helped me navigate the more complex aspects of increased visibility and influence, sharing her own experiences with staying grounded amidst success. When a major publishing house approached me about writing a memoir, it was Elena who helped me think through the implications, how to tell my story honestly without exploiting the pain of my past or villainizing the Palmers, how to craft a narrative that offered hope without oversimplifying the very real challenges of the foster care system. The Met Gala had offered an unexpected moment of closure. As I chatted with a famous filmmaker about our foundation work, I spotted a familiar face across the room, James's aunt, Catherine Whitaker, a longtime board member of the museum. She had been one of the most visibly shocked witnesses to my outburst at Sarah's wedding, her expression of horror captured for posterity in one of the few photographs that had leaked from the private event. Now, seeing me in this context, not as the inappropriate daughter-in-law making a scene, but as a poised, successful woman in my own right, her face registered a complex mixture of surprise and reassessment. When our eyes met, I smiled and nodded politely, neither seeking her approval nor avoiding her judgment. She hesitated, then nodded back with what appeared to be genuine respect. It was a small interaction, barely lasting seconds, but it symbolized a larger truth. I had not needed to defeat the Palmers or their social circle. I had simply needed to stop allowing their metrics to define my worth. Looking back on the journey of the past year, I'm struck how what began as a painful confrontation became a catalyst for growth, not just for me, but for everyone involved. The Palmers are not perfect. They still have their moments of snobbery and insensitivity. I am not perfect. I still sometimes bristle at perceived slights or feel the shadow of old insecurities. But we are all more authentic, more honest about who we are and what matters. The walls of pretense and performance that separated us have been, if not completely demolished, at least made transparent enough to see the humanity on both sides. And in that transparency, we have found something closer to real family than all the carefully orchestrated holiday dinners and social appearances ever provided. The true revelation has been understanding that acceptance, whether from family, peers, or society, is meaningless if it requires you to erase essential parts of yourself. Real belonging doesn't come from fitting into someone else's framework. It comes from building your own framework and inviting others to join you there on equal terms. My background in foster care, which the Palmers had once viewed as a regrettable chapter best left unmentioned, has become the foundation of my most meaningful work. The resilience, adaptability, and empathy I developed through those experiences aren't deficiencies to be overcome, but strengths to be celebrated. And in embracing that truth fully, without apology or explanation, I found a confidence and clarity that no external validation could provide. If you're watching this and something in my story resonates with you, know that you don't have to choose between belonging and authenticity. You don't have to make yourself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for you. Whether it's family dynamics, workplace culture, or social circles, you have the right to be fully yourself, to be valued for exactly who you are. The people who are meant to be in your life will adjust their expectations, not demand that you adjust your existence. And those who can't or won't make that adjustment, their limitations aren't your failure. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stop trying to earn acceptance from people who aren't prepared to give it freely. Your worth isn't determined by your background, your connections, or your conformity to others' expectations. It's determined by your integrity, your compassion, your willingness to stand in your truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If this story has meant something to you, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with redefining family or standing up for yourself in the comments below. How have you navigated challenging family dynamics or found your authentic voice? Give this video a like if it resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that they deserve to be valued for exactly who they are. No conditions, no exceptions, no apologies.